Fix it, janitor. The words echoed across the vast testing hangar, sharp enough to cut through the steady hum of generators and the distant whine of turbine diagnostics. For a moment, nobody moved. Then laughter spread through the room. Engineers exchanged amused glances. Executives smirked behind polished conference badges. Even a few technicians lowered their eyes, unwilling to watch what they assumed would be another public humiliation. Standing alone near a yellow maintenance cart, Mason Callahan simply looked at the woman who had spoken. Victoria Hale, CEO of Aurora Aerospace, stood beneath the gleaming wing of a prototype business jet worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. At 37, she was celebrated in magazines, interviewed on financial networks, and praised as the youngest aerospace CEO in company history. She was brilliant, ambitious, and at this moment, visibly irritated. The reason for that irritation sat 20 feet away. A $10 million jet engine had failed its certification test for the third time in 6 weeks. Hundreds of investors were waiting for answers. Regulators were demanding reports. Aurora's stock had already dropped 9%. And now, in front of board members, engineers, and reporters, nobody could explain why. Mason rested both hands on the handle of his mop. His gray maintenance uniform was clean but worn. A faded employee badge hung from his pocket. Most people in the building knew him only as the quiet janitor who arrived before sunrise and left after dark. Few noticed him. Fewer still spoke to him. "Well," Victoria asked, crossing her arms. "You've been staring at that engine all week." More laughter followed. "Maybe he knows something our engineers don't," one executive joked. "Careful," another added. "He might ask for a raise." The room erupted again. Mason remained calm. Outside the massive hangar doors, rain tapped softly against the metal roof. The scent of machine oil mixed with the cool smell of approaching weather. Bright white lights reflected across the polished floor, turning the entire space into a stage. Through it all, Mason's expression never changed. "You think it's funny?" Victoria asked. "No," Mason said quietly. The laughter faded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Then what do you think?" she challenged. Mason glanced toward the engine mounted on its testing frame. "I think somebody is listening to the wrong problem." A few eyebrows lifted. Several engineers exchanged puzzled looks. Victoria smiled, but there was irritation behind it now. "Interesting answer." She stepped forward. "Tell you what, Mr. Callahan, since you seem so interested, why don't you fix it?" More laughter followed immediately, this time louder, more confident, more cruel. Mason looked around the room. Nobody expected him to answer. Nobody expected him to accept. They expected embarrassment. They expected retreat. They expected silence. Instead, Mason nodded once. "I can." The hangar became strangely quiet. One engineer actually laughed again, believing it had to be a joke. Another shook his head. A board member nearly dropped his coffee. Victoria studied him carefully for the first time. "You can?" she repeated. "Yes. You're telling me you can repair a $10 million propulsion system that our senior engineering team can't diagnose?" Mason looked directly at the engine. "No," several smiles returned. "Then what are you saying?" Victoria asked. Mason's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the polished turbine housing. "I'm saying the engine isn't broken." This time nobody laughed. The silence arrived suddenly, like a door closing. Somewhere near the back of the hangar, a wrench slipped from someone's hand and clattered against concrete. Victoria's confident smile disappeared. The lead engineer straightened. 3 board members looked at one another. Mason slowly stepped away from his maintenance cart and walked toward the enormous engine. The polished metal reflected the overhead lights like liquid silver. For several seconds, he simply stood there listening. Not touching, not measuring, just listening. The room watched in disbelief. Then Mason tilted his head slightly and spoke a sentence that made the color drain from Victoria Hale's face. "This engine is hiding something," he said softly. "And whoever hid it never expected me to find it." The silence lingered for several long seconds after Mason spoke. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the engine. Nobody seemed quite sure what to say next. Victoria Hale recovered first. She folded her arms tightly across her tailored navy blazer and forced a small smile. "An engine is hiding something?" she asked. "That is your professional opinion?" A few nervous chuckles surfaced around the hangar. Mason did not look at her. His attention remained on the massive turbine assembly suspended inside its steel testing frame. The polished fan blades reflected rows of bright industrial lights overhead. "It is not an opinion," Mason said calmly. "It is a pattern." The lead engineer, Grant Mercer, stepped forward. At 52, he had spent nearly 3 decades in aerospace manufacturing and did not appreciate being challenged by a maintenance worker. "A pattern," he repeated. "We have run thermal scans, vibration analysis, fuel flow diagnostics, software simulations, and structural inspections. Every system has been reviewed." Mason nodded. "I know." Grant frowned. "You know? I read the reports." The engineer blinked. "Those reports are restricted." "Not very restricted," Mason replied. "Most people leave them open on their screens when they go to lunch." Several employees shifted uncomfortably. Victoria narrowed her eyes. Mason slowly walked around the engine. His work boots echoed softly against the polished concrete floor. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the hangar roof like distant applause. "You all keep searching for a failed component," Mason said. "A damaged blade, a fuel issue, a software glitch, something mechanical. Because those are the logical possibilities," Grant replied. "No," Mason said. "Those are the obvious possibilities." The room grew quiet again. Mason stopped near the rear section of the engine housing and placed his hand lightly against the outer casing. Not touching it with authority, not performing for an audience, simply listening. "What exactly are you hearing?" Victoria asked. Mason glanced toward her. "Nothing." Several executives exchanged confused looks. "That does not make sense," Grant said. "Exactly." Mason pointed toward the turbine assembly. "That is the problem." The engineer laughed softly. "Now I know you are guessing." Mason looked directly at him. "How many certification runs failed?" 3. "How many produced identical vibration signatures?" Grant hesitated. "All 3. "How many generated exactly the same thermal profile?" Another pause. "All 3. "And how many experienced identical timing variations during startup?" Grant did not answer immediately. The confidence in his expression began to weaken. Mason already knew the answer. "All 3. Mason said quietly. "Machines do not fail that perfectly." The statement seemed to settle over the room like fog. Mason continued walking around the engine. "Mechanical failures create variation. Tiny differences, different temperatures, different stress responses, different acoustic fingerprints." He looked back at the gathered engineers. "This engine is behaving like it is reading a script." Nobody laughed now. Victoria felt a small knot forming in her stomach. She could see it happening. The room was beginning to listen. Not because Mason sounded dramatic. Because he sounded certain. The dangerous kind of certain. Grant quickly pulled out a tablet and reviewed several test summaries. The color in his face shifted slightly. "That is impossible," he muttered. Mason stopped beside a monitoring station. Rows of test data scrolled across multiple screens. "Maybe," he said, "but impossible things tend to leave evidence." Victoria stepped forward. "What evidence?" Mason studied the screen. Numbers streamed downward in organized columns. Fuel pressure, exhaust temperature, rotational speed, vibration frequency. Thousands of measurements collected during months of testing. Most people saw data. Mason appeared to see a story. His eyes paused on one line. Then another. Then another. The hangar seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he pointed to a small timestamp buried deep inside the records. "There." Grant leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" Mason did not answer immediately. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the darkening sky. Inside, the white lights hummed overhead. "You are looking," Mason said softly, "at the only honest number in the entire report." Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken. "What does that mean?" Mason turned toward her for the first time since approaching the engine. His expression remained calm, but there was something else in his eyes now. Recognition. Understanding. The look of a man who had just found the first loose thread in a much larger fabric. "It means," he said, "someone changed the data after the test was completed." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Someone changed the data after the test was completed. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The giant hangar seemed suspended in a strange stillness. The rain continued striking the roof overhead. Computer screens glowed across rows of engineering stations. Yet all attention remained fixed on Mason Callahan. Grant Mercer stared at the timestamp highlighted on his tablet. He checked another report. Then another. His fingers moved faster now. The confidence he had carried all afternoon was quietly slipping away. That cannot be right, he muttered. The logs are protected. Mason nodded. They are supposed to be. Victoria stepped closer to the monitor. Explain it. Mason looked at the scrolling data. I can explain the symptom. Then do it. His eyes followed several columns before he spoke again. Every digital system leaves fingerprints. Most people focus on what was changed. Experienced engineers focus on when it was changed. Grant looked up sharply. Experienced engineers? Mason offered no response. Instead, he pointed toward another timestamp buried inside the certification records. That entry happened 8 minutes after the test ended. Grant zoomed in. His expression darkened. How did you see that? Mason shrugged lightly. It stood out. The answer frustrated everyone because it sounded too simple. Yet the more they checked, the more his observation held up. Another timestamp. Another inconsistency. Then another. Small details. Tiny details. The kind most people ignored because they appeared insignificant. Victoria felt something unfamiliar creeping into her thoughts. Doubt. Not doubt about Mason. Doubt about everything else. Who are you? One board member finally asked. Mason looked away from the screen. Maintenance staff. Several executives exchanged glances. Nobody believed that answer anymore. The silence stretched again. Then an older engineer near the back of the room slowly stood from his workstation. His name was Walter Finch. He had worked in aerospace longer than anyone else in the building. His silver hair and quiet reputation made him easy to overlook. Yet when he spoke, people listened. I know him. The room turned. Walter stepped forward carefully. At least I think I do. Victoria frowned. What does that mean? Walter never took his eyes off Mason. About 15 years ago, I attended an aerospace propulsion symposium in Seattle. Mason remained silent. Walter continued. There was a keynote speaker. A strange look crossed his face. Part disbelief. Part memory. Youngest lead systems architect I had ever seen. Several engineers looked confused. Walter pointed directly toward Mason. The entire room stood and applauded his presentation. Grant laughed nervously. You were saying the janitor gave a keynote speech? Walter ignored him. He presented a predictive thermal balancing model that changed turbine efficiency calculations. Victoria looked from Walter to Mason. Is that true? Mason said nothing. Walter took another step forward. People said he was going to transform aviation. The rain outside intensified. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. Inside the hangar, nobody moved. What happened? Victoria asked quietly. Walter looked at Mason again. One day he disappeared. The room grew even quieter. Mason lowered his eyes toward the floor. That was a long time ago. Not for the industry, Walter replied. Entire companies still use your work. Grant stared at Mason in disbelief. Wait. He shook his head. You are telling me this maintenance worker designed propulsion systems? Walter gave a small nod. Some of the concepts still appear in modern engines. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. She looked at Mason differently now. Not as a janitor. Not as an employee. As a mystery. Why would someone walk away from that? She asked softly. For the first time all afternoon, something changed in Mason's expression. The calm remained. The dignity remained. But behind his eyes appeared a shadow of old pain. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Simply human. He glanced briefly toward a worn photograph tucked inside his wallet, barely visible through his uniform pocket. A young girl smiling beside a woman with kind eyes. Then he looked away. Sometimes life changes your plans, he said quietly. Nobody laughed. Nobody challenged him. Even Grant lowered his gaze. There was too much truth in that answer. Too much weight. Victoria studied him carefully. The man standing before her was no longer fitting into any category she understood. He knew propulsion systems. He knew certification protocols. He knew data integrity. And somehow he had ended up pushing a mop through hallways every night. The contradiction made no sense. Then Mason turned back toward the monitor. His voice became steady once more. My past is not important. He pointed toward the altered records. This is... Grant swallowed hard. Can you prove the data was manipulated? Mason stared at the screen for several long seconds. Then he found another entry. Another timestamp. Another hidden inconsistency. And when he finally spoke, even Walter Finch looked stunned. Not only can I prove it, Mason said quietly. I think I just found the person who started it. The statement struck the room like a sudden drop in air pressure. Not only can I prove it. I think I just found the person who started it. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the soft hum of computer servers and the distant rain tapping against the massive hangar doors. Grant Mercer stared at the monitor. Victoria Hale stared at Mason. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere had changed completely. Less than an hour ago, they had laughed at a janitor. Now they were waiting for him to explain what their experts could not. Mason leaned slightly toward the workstation. Rows of data stretched across the screen like endless highways of numbers. To most people it looked overwhelming. To him it looked familiar. "Show me the original test archive," he said. Grant hesitated. "That system requires executive authorization." "Then authorize it," Mason replied. Victoria immediately stepped forward. "Do it." Grant entered several security credentials. Multiple windows opened. Archived logs appeared. Backup records. Internal timestamps. Validation reports. Thousands of files accumulated over months of testing. Mason studied them silently. The room waited. A full minute passed. Then another. Nobody interrupted him. Even the board members who normally checked their phones every few seconds remained focused. There was something about the way he worked. No performance. No arrogance. No attempt to impress anyone. Just quiet concentration. The kind that comes from years of experience. "There," Mason finally said. Grant leaned closer. "What is it?" Mason pointed toward a sequence buried inside the archive. "This report was modified." "We already know that." "No," Mason shook his head. "You know it was modified. You do not know why." Victoria folded her arms. "Then tell us." Mason opened a second file beside the first. Then a third. Then a fourth. The comparison made several engineers straighten in their seats. "The failure reports are identical," Mason said. "Exactly identical." Grant frowned. "That is what concerned you before." "Because it should not happen." Mason clicked through another set of records. "But now I know something else." He pointed toward the screen. "These reports were copied." Silence followed. One board member blinked. "Copied?" Mason nodded. "Not generated independently." "Copied." Grant looked stunned. "That is impossible." "No," Mason remained calm. "It is lazy." Several engineers moved closer. Victoria could feel tension spreading through the room. The kind of tension that appears when people realize a problem may be much larger than they imagined. Mason enlarged several hidden metadata fields. Tiny details appeared. Creation times. Internal system markers. Validation signatures. Most people would never have noticed them. "Look here," Mason said. "The certification failures happened on different dates." Grant nodded. "Correct." "Then explain why every internal validation marker matches down to the millisecond." Grant opened his mouth, then stopped. He could not. Because Mason was right. The room fell silent again. Walter Finch slowly removed his glasses. "Good Lord," he whispered. Mason continued. "Somebody took one failure report and duplicated it across multiple test events." Victoria felt a chill run through her arms. Why would anyone do that? Mason looked at her. Because the real results were different. Nobody liked that answer. The rain outside seemed louder now. Thunder rolled across the distant horizon. Inside the hangar, every person suddenly understood the implications. If the reports were copied, then the actual test data had been hidden. If the actual data had been hidden, then nobody knew the real condition of the engine program. And if nobody knew the real condition of the engine program, Aurora Aerospace had a problem far bigger than a failed certification. Mason clicked deeper into the archive. His eyes narrowed. Then he stopped. Grant noticed immediately. "What did you find?" Mason did not answer right away. He simply stared at the screen. Victoria stepped closer. "Mason." Finally he pointed. "This access credential." Grant looked confused. "What about it?" "It should not exist." Several engineers leaned forward. Victoria stared at the user identification number displayed on the screen. It belonged to someone with elevated system authority. Someone with access beyond the engineering department. Someone powerful. "Who is it assigned to?" Victoria asked. Mason opened the authorization profile. The screen refreshed. A name appeared. The room collectively held its breath. Grant's face lost color. Walter Finch looked genuinely shocked. Several executives froze where they stood. Victoria stared at the name for 3 full seconds before speaking. "That cannot be right." Mason remained completely still. "That is what the data says." Victoria slowly looked up from the screen. The person connected to the altered records was not a technician, not an engineer, not a contractor. The account belonged to someone who sat only a few feet away from her during every executive meeting. Someone trusted, someone influential, someone who helped oversee the entire engine program. And for the first time that day, Victoria realized this mystery might be reaching far beyond the testing floor. The name remained on the screen like a crack spreading through glass. Nobody wanted to speak first. Nobody wanted to be the person who acknowledged what everyone was seeing. The authorization profile belonged to Daniel Cross, Aurora Aerospace's Chief Operations Officer. For 7 years, Daniel had been Victoria Hale's closest executive partner. He attended every board meeting, approved every major operational decision, and helped oversee the company's expansion from a regional manufacturer into one of the fastest-growing aerospace firms in the country. Victoria stared at the screen. There has to be another explanation. Her voice sounded quieter now, less certain. Grant Mercer swallowed hard. Daniel has system access. Walter Finch slowly nodded. More access than almost anyone. Mason remained calm. Access alone does not prove responsibility. Several people released small breaths of relief. But Mason was not finished. It only tells us where to look next. Outside, the storm continued gathering strength. Rain streamed down the massive hangar windows. The afternoon sunlight had disappeared behind dark clouds, leaving the building illuminated by rows of bright industrial lights. The atmosphere felt different now. Heavier. More serious. Victoria folded her arms. Then keep looking. Mason returned his attention to the workstation. Hundreds of archived files remained untouched. Most investigations stop too early, he thought. Most people find one suspicious detail and convince themselves they have found the answer. Real truth rarely works that way. Real truth usually hides behind the first explanation. His fingers moved across the keyboard. One file opened, then another. Internal communications, testing authorizations, engineering change requests, procurement approvals. The deeper he went, the quieter the room became. What are you searching for? Victoria asked. Patterns. Again. Mason nodded. People leave patterns just like machines do. Walter smiled faintly. That sounds exactly like something an engineer would say. Mason ignored the comment. A new set of records appeared. This time the files were not technical. Financial approvals, vendor authorizations, supply chain modifications. Grant frowned. Why are you looking at procurement records? Mason pointed toward the engine. Because somebody wanted it to fail. Several executives exchanged nervous looks. You still believe that? Grant asked. Mason looked directly at him. No, Grant blinked. No, I know it. The room fell silent once more. Mason opened a maintenance history report. Then another. Then a third. Each revealed the same supplier identification number. The same vendor authorization code. The same chain of approvals. Victoria leaned closer. What am I looking at? Mason highlighted a component buried deep within the engine assembly. This sensor. Grant studied it. Temperature regulation monitor. Correct. What about it? Mason opened another file. It failed quality inspection 4 months ago. Grant frowned. That cannot be right. Read the report. Grant did. His eyes widened. Rejected for calibration instability. Mason nodded. Yet somehow it was installed anyway. Victoria looked confused. Would one sensor cause all of this? Not by itself. Mason opened another file. But 3 defective sensors would. More silence. More uneasy glances. Mason continued tracing records backward through the procurement system. Every path led toward the same approval chain. Every approval chain led toward Daniel Cross's operational division. Still, Mason did not jump to conclusions. Something bothered him. Something did not fit. He leaned back slightly. No, Victoria looked up. What? Mason stared at the screen. This is wrong. Grant looked confused. What is wrong? Mason pointed toward the timeline. The approvals started before Daniel authorized them. Walter stepped closer. What does that mean? Mason followed the dates again, one by one, carefully, methodically. Then he found it. A hidden administrative signature buried beneath multiple system layers. Small, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore once discovered. Mason felt his pulse slow, the way it always did when a complicated puzzle suddenly became clear. There it is. Victoria stepped beside him. What? Mason opened the authorization trail. Additional names appeared. Additional accounts. Additional approvals. The room watched silently as the picture expanded. This was not one person. This was not one decision. This was not one bad report. It was a network, a chain, a coordinated effort stretching across multiple departments. Grant stared at the screen in disbelief. Good Lord. Walter removed his glasses again. That is impossible. Mason slowly shook his head. No, his voice remained calm. It is organized. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face, because suddenly she understood what Mason had been trying to tell them from the beginning. The engine was never the real problem. The failed tests were never the real problem. Even the altered reports were only symptoms. Something much larger was hiding beneath the surface, something capable of affecting the entire company. Then Mason opened the final authorization record. The room froze, because the signature attached to the earliest approval belonged neither to Daniel Cross nor to any engineer in the building. It belonged to someone far more powerful, someone with influence over investors, board decisions, and the future of Aurora Aerospace itself. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The final authorization record glowed on the monitor like a warning light that could no longer be ignored. Rain continued sliding down the towering glass panels overlooking the runway. The storm outside had deepened, covering the horizon in shades of gray. Inside the hangar, however, the atmosphere felt even darker. Victoria Hale stared at the screen. Her mind raced through years of meetings, contracts, investor calls, and strategic partnerships. The name attached to the earliest approval was not an engineer. It was not a department manager. It was not even an executive employee. It belonged to Richard Sterling, chairman of the board and the company's largest outside investor. Several people instinctively looked toward one another, as if hoping someone would explain why such a name appeared in technical authorization records. Nobody could. Grant Mercer slowly lowered himself into a chair. This does not make sense. Walter Finch remained standing, his expression grim. Unfortunately, it makes too much sense. Victoria turned toward him. What do you mean? Walter folded his arms. Investors care about timelines. Certification delays cost money. Every failed test creates pressure. Victoria looked back at the screen. You are suggesting someone manipulated reports to protect stock value? I am suggesting nothing, Walter replied. I am observing what the records appear to show. Mason remained silent. He understood something important. Facts speak best when they are allowed to breathe. The moment people start forcing conclusions, truth becomes harder to hear. He continued searching through the records. Another approval chain appeared. Then another. Every path led deeper into the same network. Victoria watched him carefully. Earlier that day, she had viewed him as background noise. Now she found herself waiting for every word he spoke. What are you looking for now? She asked. Motivation. Grant looked up. We already have evidence. Evidence tells us what happened, Mason said. Motivation tells us why. The room fell quiet again. Mason opened a series of financial reports linked to engine development. Quarterly projections, investor presentations, growth forecasts, revenue estimates. The numbers painted a story. Aurora Aerospace had promised aggressive expansion, new aircraft contracts, international partnerships, government bids. Everything depended on certification being completed on schedule. Delays threatened billions of dollars in future opportunities. Walter sighed softly. There it is. Victoria saw it too. The pattern was becoming clearer. Every time testing failed, pressure increased. Every time pressure increased, records became less transparent. Every time transparency disappeared, someone approved another shortcut. They were buying time, Grant whispered. Mason nodded. Most likely. Victoria rubbed her forehead. No, she shook her head slowly. Richard would never risk the company. Mason finally looked directly at her. Maybe he believed he was saving it. The answer struck her harder than any accusation. Because it felt possible. Too possible. People rarely justify bad decisions by calling them bad decisions. They convince themselves they are protecting something important. A company, a family, a dream. Outside, thunder rolled across the airfield. Inside, another file appeared on Mason's screen. This one stopped him. Grant noticed immediately. What is it? Mason enlarged the document. His eyes narrowed. Then he opened a second file beside it. Victoria stepped closer. What did you find? Mason did not answer immediately. The room waited. This changes everything. Nobody moved. How? Victoria asked. Mason pointed toward a series of private communications attached to the authorization records. Internal messages. Scheduling requests. emergency meetings, financial reviews. But one detail stood apart from the rest. Richard Sterling's name appeared repeatedly, yet every critical decision seemed to originate elsewhere. Grant frowned. I do not understand. Mason opened another message. Then another. Slowly the pattern emerged. Walter's eyes widened first, then Victoria's, then several board members. Richard was not directing this, Walter said quietly. Mason nodded. No, Victoria stared at the screen. He was being directed. The room froze. Every assumption they had formed during the last hour suddenly shifted. Richard Sterling was involved, yes. His approvals were everywhere. His signatures appeared throughout the records. But the deeper Mason dug, the more obvious another truth became. Someone had been feeding him selective information. Someone had been shaping every recommendation before it reached him. Someone had positioned themselves between the facts and the people making decisions. Victoria slowly turned toward the executive offices overlooking the hangar floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the storm outside. For years, she had trusted the people who occupied those offices. For years, she had assumed the information reaching her desk was accurate. Now she was no longer sure. Then Mason opened the oldest communication in the archive. The first message connected to the entire chain. He read it silently. His expression hardened for the first time all day, not with anger, with certainty. When he finally looked up, every person in the room knew he had found something significant. The board chairman is not the architect of this, Mason said quietly. He is only one piece of it. Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken. Then who is? Mason turned the monitor toward her. That, he said, is the question someone has spent 3 years making sure nobody would ever ask. The question lingered in the air long after Mason spoke it. That is the question someone has spent 3 years making sure nobody would ever ask. No one in the hangar seemed willing to move. Outside, the storm rolled across the airfield, covering the runway lights in a veil of rain and mist. Inside, the glow of computer monitors reflected across worried faces. Victoria Hale stared at the screen before her. Every assumption she had formed over the past several hours had been challenged. First the engine, then the reports, then Daniel Cross, then Richard Sterling. Every answer had uncovered a larger mystery. Mason continued scrolling through the archive. His movements remained steady, patient, deliberate. The behavior of a man who understood that truth rarely appears all at once. It reveals itself one layer at a time. Walter Finch broke the silence first. What exactly are we looking at? Mason enlarged a communication thread. Hundreds of messages appeared. Scheduling requests, status updates, financial projections. Most looked ordinary. The kind of routine corporate communication nobody would ever question. Yet when viewed together, they revealed something different. A pattern. Notice the timing, Mason said. Grant Mercer leaned closer. Timing of what? Mason highlighted several messages. Every recommendation that pushed the program forward arrived shortly before critical board reviews. Victoria studied the dates. He was right. Every major decision seemed to follow the same sequence. A warning would disappear. A concern would be minimized. A revised projection would appear. Then approval would move forward. Someone was controlling the flow of information, Walter said quietly. Mason nodded. Exactly. Victoria folded her arms tightly. Who? Mason opened another communication file. Then another. The room watched in silence. Finally he stopped. A name appeared repeatedly across dozens of conversations. Not as the sender, not as the recipient, as the person everyone referenced. The person everyone consulted. The person everyone trusted. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. No, Grant stared at the screen. That cannot be right. Walter removed his glasses once more. Unfortunately, it might be. The name belonged to Eleanor Pierce, Aurora Aerospace's Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. For nearly a decade, she had served as one of the company's most respected leaders. Investors trusted her. Employees admired her. Industry publications regularly listed her among the most influential women in aerospace. Victoria herself had promoted her twice. This makes no sense, Victoria said. Eleanor helped build this company. Mason looked at her calmly. That does not mean she could not influence it. Influence is not manipulation. No, Mason agreed. But hiding information is. The room fell silent again. Victoria stared toward the executive offices overlooking the hangar floor. Eleanor's office sat among them. Dark, empty. She had left for a conference in Washington 2 days earlier. Or at least that was what everyone believed. Mason continued reviewing the records. Then he opened a travel authorization file. His eyes narrowed. Interesting. Grant immediately noticed. What? Mason enlarged the document. She never went to Washington. Victoria looked stunned. What are you talking about? Mason pointed to the authorization record. The trip was canceled. Walter frowned. Then where is she? Another file opened. Hotel reservations. Transportation records. Meeting schedules. Victoria felt a chill run through her. Eleanor had not traveled to Washington. She had flown to Phoenix, then Denver, then Dallas. Quiet trips, unannounced meetings, private investor gatherings. None of them appeared on official company calendars. Why would she hide that? Grant asked. Mason remained focused on the screen. Because she did not want anyone comparing these schedules. Another document appeared, then another. Slowly a picture emerged. Every hidden trip coincided with a critical certification milestone. Every meeting occurred shortly before reports were altered. Every investor gathering happened before public announcements. Victoria stared at the timeline in disbelief. She knew. Mason nodded slowly. At minimum, she knew something. The distinction mattered. Facts first, conclusions later. Yet even that careful approach could not hide the growing reality. The pattern surrounding Eleanor Pierce was impossible to ignore. Walter leaned back heavily. 3 years. His voice sounded almost exhausted. 3 years of this. Mason remained silent. Then he opened one final communication buried deep within the archive. Unlike the others, this message had been encrypted, hidden beneath multiple security layers. Somebody had worked hard to make sure it remained unseen. The file opened. The room held its breath. Victoria stepped closer. Grant stood. Walter moved beside them. Nobody spoke. They simply stared at the screen. Because the message did not contain technical instructions. It did not discuss certification. It did not mention engineering. Instead, it contained a single sentence that changed everything. A sentence written months before the first failed test. A sentence proving the engine problems were never accidental. Mason read it quietly, then looked up. For the first time all day, even his calm expression revealed surprise. Victoria, he said softly, you were never the target. The words settled over the room with a weight that nobody expected. You were never the target. Victoria Hale stared at Mason as if she had misheard him. Around them, the hangar remained silent except for the distant rumble of thunder beyond the runway. The giant engine stood motionless beneath the bright lights, no longer the center of attention. The real story had moved far beyond machinery. What does that mean? Victoria asked quietly. Mason looked back at the encrypted message. It means this was never about embarrassing a chief executive. Grant Mercer stepped closer. Then what was it about? Mason enlarged the communication. The sender information remained hidden behind multiple layers of encryption, but the message itself was simple. Chillingly simple. Prepare the conditions. The transition must appear necessary. Victoria felt a knot form in her stomach. Transition. Walter Finch read the line twice. Then a third time. Suddenly his expression changed. Oh no. Several executives looked toward him. What? Walter slowly exhaled. Corporate transition. Nobody spoke. The implication arrived all at once. Not a failed project. Not temporary delays. A leadership transition. Mason nodded. That is what the evidence suggests. Victoria stared at the screen. Someone wanted me removed. Someone wanted circumstances that would justify removing you. The distinction mattered. Mason always returned to facts. Not assumptions. Facts. Grant rubbed his forehead. This is insane. Mason opened another file. Then another. Then another. Board review schedules appeared. Executive performance evaluations. Investor briefing notes. Everything aligned with disturbing precision. Every certification failure weakened confidence in Victoria's leadership. Every altered report increased pressure from investors. Every hidden meeting strengthened alternative leadership plans. Walter looked pale. They were building a case. Victoria did not answer. She was reading the records herself now. Month after month. Decision after decision. A narrative had been quietly constructed around her. One that portrayed her as increasingly incapable of leading the company through its largest expansion effort. The realization hurt more than she expected. Not because of the threat to her position. Because many of the people involved were individuals she trusted. People she had mentored, promoted, defended. Outside, Rain continued falling in steady sheets across the runway. Inside, another notification appeared on Mason's screen. A video conference request. The board. Multiple members. Immediate attendance required. Several executives exchanged worried glances. News traveled quickly at Aurora Aerospace. Clearly, word of the investigation had already reached higher levels. Victoria looked at Mason. Put it on the main screen. Moments later, the giant display suspended above the testing area flickered to life. One by one, faces appeared. Board members from different cities. Legal advisors. Financial consultants. Finally, Richard Sterling himself joined the call. The chairman looked tired. Older than he had during the last quarterly meeting. Victoria, he said. What is happening? Before she could answer, Walter spoke. You need to see this. For the next 20 minutes, the room transformed into something resembling a courtroom without a judge. Evidence appeared one piece at a time. Authorization logs. Procurement records. Travel schedules. Hidden communications. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. Facts carried enough weight on their own. Richard Sterling listened carefully. Several times he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Several times he asked for documents to be displayed again. Each time the evidence became harder to dismiss. Finally, he looked directly into the camera. I never authorized any effort to remove Victoria. Mason nodded. The records support that statement. Richard blinked. They do. Yes. Mason opened another file. Your approvals were based on information that appears incomplete. For the first time all evening, Victoria noticed something surprising. Relief crossed Richard's face. Not because the situation was improving, because someone had finally uncovered the truth. The old man looked exhausted. Then I was manipulated too. It appears so, Mason replied. Silence followed. Then another board member spoke. Where is Eleanor Pierce? Nobody answered. Her phone remained inactive. Her office remained empty. Her schedule remained unexplained. Richard Sterling looked toward the camera. Effective immediately, I am authorizing a full independent investigation. Nobody objected. They could not. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet as Mason reviewed the final records, something continued bothering him. One detail remained unresolved. One missing piece. He opened the oldest archived file again. The first communication connected to the entire chain. The same message that had started everything. Prepare the conditions. The transition must appear necessary. This time he noticed something he had missed before. A hidden attachment. Small. Buried. Nearly invisible. Mason opened it. The file loaded. Then the color drained from several faces simultaneously. Because staring back from the screen was not a financial plan. Not an engineering report. Not an investor presentation. It was a photograph. A photograph of Mason Callahan taken 3 years earlier, standing beside his young daughter Lily outside an elementary school. The photograph seemed to pull all the air from the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. On the giant screen above the hangar floor, Mason stood beside a much younger Lily outside her elementary school. She could not have been more than 7 years old. She was smiling, holding a science fair ribbon in one hand and her father's hand in the other. The image looked ordinary, innocent, yet it was buried inside an encrypted file connected to years of manipulated records and hidden corporate decisions. Victoria stared at the screen. Why would they have this? Mason did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. For the first time that day, the mystery felt personal. Walter Finch looked troubled. Somebody was watching you. Mason nodded slowly. Looks that way. Richard Sterling's voice came through the conference speakers. I have never seen that image before. Nobody doubted him anymore. The evidence had already shown he was not directing events. He had been used, just like many others. Mason opened the file metadata. The creation date appeared. 3 years earlier. The same month he had applied for a maintenance position at Aurora Aerospace. Grant Mercer blinked in disbelief. They knew who you were. Mason continued reading. Another hidden document appeared. Then another. Employment records. Archived industry articles. Patent filings. Conference presentations. His old career had been carefully collected and organized. Victoria felt a chill. They did not hire a janitor by accident. Mason finally looked up. No, silence followed. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Somebody had known exactly who Mason Callahan was. A respected propulsion architect. A man whose ideas still influenced modern engine design. A man who had quietly disappeared after losing his wife and choosing to focus on raising his daughter. Someone had brought him into the company, not because they wanted his expertise, because they wanted him close. Close enough to monitor, close enough to control, close enough to ensure he never regained influence. Richard Sterling spoke again. His voice sounded heavy. The investigation begins immediately. Effective now. Eleanor Pierce is suspended pending review. Daniel Cross is suspended pending review. All associated authorizations are frozen. Nobody objected. They could not. The evidence spoke for itself. Yet Mason's attention drifted back toward the giant engine standing beneath the bright lights. The machine that had started everything. The machine everyone believed was broken. He walked toward it slowly. The room watched. Rain still fell outside. Thunder still echoed beyond the runway. But something inside the hangar had changed. The tension was gone. In its place stood clarity. Mason placed a hand lightly against the engine housing. "The engine works," he said quietly. Grant looked surprised. "You are sure?" Mason smiled faintly. "I was sure hours ago." A few people laughed softly. Not mocking laughter. Respectful laughter. The kind that follows relief. Grant shook his head. "Then all this time, the machine was never the problem," Mason finished. Victoria watched him carefully. Then she stepped forward. "I owe you an apology." Mason looked at her. "For what?" "For seeing a uniform instead of a person." The words hung in the air. Honest. Uncomfortable. Real. Mason considered them for a moment before nodding. "We all do that sometimes." Victoria smiled sadly. "Not all of us get exposed so publicly." A few board members chuckled. Even Richard Sterling smiled from the conference screen. For the first time all day, the room felt lighter. Hours later, after the calls ended and the investigation teams arrived, Mason quietly gathered his things. No speeches, no demands, no requests for recognition. Just a maintenance cart, a worn jacket, and a photograph of Lily. He was halfway across the hangar when Victoria called after him. "Mason." He stopped. "The board is going to want to meet with you. Probably. And they may offer you something significant." Mason smiled. "I already have something significant." He held up the photograph. Victoria looked at the image of Lily and understood immediately. The next morning, as sunlight broke through the storm clouds, Mason stood outside a small school building waiting for his daughter. Children poured through the doors carrying backpacks and laughter. Then Lily spotted him. "Dad," she shouted, running toward him. Mason knelt and hugged her tightly. Across the street, a black sedan slowed briefly before continuing on. Inside, Victoria Hale watched the reunion through the window. For a moment she said nothing. Then she smiled. Because after all the secrets, all the power struggles, and all the hidden agendas, the strongest person she had met was not the executive in the boardroom or the investor with